If you're a discerning, open-minded and dedicated seeker who loves a good deep dive into the nature of reality and consciousness, then do check out my book, The Grand Illusion, composed of over 10,000 hours of research and experience. Find more information and reader reviews at brendandmurphy.com/TGI.
It's just kind of how my mind works. I see things, and maybe if I came from the strict discipline of archaeology or Egyptology or oceanography, I would look at them as, well, this is just an anomaly.
Yeah.
But I think because, I don't know, ever since I was young, I've just been into everything. I could never pick a major. I studied marine biology, history, philosophy, religion, this. And I think that was a strength that I brought to the book because, more than anything, it was kind of, to me, a synthesis of a wide range of data that I think a lot of people had not really done. And I had read a lot of books on the subject for many years. And, there are excellent books just on the psychic aspect of Atlantis, past life regression, Akashic records. There's dozens of books on Edgar Cayce's concept of Atlantis, and likewise dozens of alternative archaeology books on the subject. But I hadn't really cracked the code, so to speak, because so many of them, particularly with the past life regression books that I had read, or just books on visions of past lives in high antiquity, high technology antiquity, they had presumed that the average person, necessarily believed in that to begin with. And although I believe these accounts are accurate based on what I've seen, and of course, after reading your book, much more convinced that the powers of the mind are vastly underrated. I had never really seen somebody, write something where I gave this book to my friend's mother, for example, who, she had no idea about Atlantis. She is kind of an open-minded person, very spiritual, but I wanted to write it in such a way that she could pick it up and actually say, wait a minute, there's actual evidence to support this. And at the same time, take somebody like a professional debunker, so-called professional debunker, and show them, look, the same standards to which you apply, the idea that Socrates existed, which, we only know of because of Plato. Why don't you apply that to Atlantis? Because it sounds fantastical, because it sounds like something that contradicts mainstream materialism. What is it? And so that became a major part of the book, was really seeing, why is this story so discounted? And by what criteria do we judge any ancient history? The source material for me as a professional historian beyond even 200 years is incredibly questionable. To go back to ancient Greek times, even if you're fluent in, archaic Greek, there's so little of this material left, given not just the destruction of temples, libraries, obviously the Library of Alexandria, but you're only seeing what was written down by a handful of people who were permitted to write, who could read and write. And that's in mainstream history. So when you're dealing with time spans, in this case, stretching back 200,000 years, if we take Edgar Cayce's timeline for the first kind of beginnings of what would later become, at that time, the continent of Atlantis, which is another important concept we can touch on, this question of, well, is an island, is a continent? And that was a critical part of the book, was untangling this misconception as well, because as we'll see, this civilization, if we are to believe these records by Edgar Cayce, Frederick Oliver, other channelers, and also archaeological evidence from oceanographers, this time period was nearly 250,000 years. ago and stretched for, 150 to 190,000 years itself as a civilization progressed, declined, was destroyed, was rebuilt. And that, as Rudolf Steiner said famously, this presents a major problem, because when traditional archaeologists or historians are looking for example, the lost city of Troy from the Aeneid, well, they have an idea. Okay, we go to Turkey, it's probably around here, and then who's it? Heinrich Schliemann finds it, and shocks the world that it's real. Finds the tomb of Priam and confirms essentially that this story was based on some sort of lived reality. But when you're dealing with a global culture that itself had dozens of iterations, spanning themselves thousands of years, as Rudolf Steiner said, you might as well look in Montreal or Tennessee for evidence of Atlantis rather than just the mid-Atlantic ridge. And so I think this is why so many people go, well, what are you talking about? You found Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon, or you found, Phoenician inscriptions in Brazil. That doesn't make sense. That's not where Plato said the island was. And then you have to go back and say, okay, well, what account was he talking about? You see? And as you start to piece the story together, you realize in the Edgar Cayce timeline, for example, the first, what he called thought forms, which were, I guess if you want to call it, in this chapter, I called, spirits in the material world, the first incarnations of conscious thought in third dimensionality on some level. And he's not very specific. He describes them as thought forms, wraith-like beings, describes the Earth's density as different, which again, take with a grain of salt, believe I wasn't there. But he says this happened 10.5 million years ago in Lemuria, in what would be called the American Southwest, which he at the time says, stretching for millions of years, was really the only portion of the United States, Arizona, Nevada, parts of Colorado, that was a major landmass. The Mississippi Basin would have been an ocean. There was an inland ocean, which has been confirmed in Arizona right now. And over time, from 10.5 million years, he calls it, to roughly 210,000 years, these thought forms experimented, what he called entangled with the already existing animal and mineral and plant kingdoms. He calls them all kingdoms. He believed everything was conscious, and in some sense, I think from your work that you would agree. And this continent that he would have called Atlantis at the time began as a lost continent. Truly, when people say that, I would say they're correct if they're referring to this time period. And it would have stretched, according to him, basically where the Atlantic Ocean in its entirety, from the Gulf of Mexico to modern day Spain, is, and filled the entire thing. And this would have existed in his timeline from 200,010 BC, with the incarnation of a thought form or soul, however you want to say it, called Amelius, who had a twin soul and then split off and created this person called Lilith, and then the sexes divided and they ruled for a time. And then later, during what he calls 50,722, very specific, dealing with the megafauna, which again would have been everywhere. In Australia, you would have had 9-foot carnivorous kangaroos running around. It was pretty terrifying. And so these people who lived in a society, according to him, more advanced than ours, still had to face the natural world. And he said one of their solutions to that was, it's very strange, but essentially a directed energy weapon that they beamed at the stratosphere, according to him, and created a bounce back effect targeting volcanic flows near where these megafauna were gathering, hoping to change the climate on a local level and kill their food supply. This is what I mean. It's a very bizarre reading for a man in a trance on a couch in 1932, before any of these weapons existed. So he calls it things like the death ray, and one day you will discover what this technology is. He's talking to, housewives and businessmen in Virginia Beach in 1932. And so in any case, just to briefly discuss this, he says it created the desired effect, but it precipitated a magnetic pole shift that had already been in progress, and essentially precipitated an ice age and a tectonic shift that fractured the original continent into 5 islands. And what's really weird is, as I was doing my corroborating evidence part of the book, where every time he says something, if I can find something from so-called mainstream science that, directly or indirectly aligns with it, I try. And what's unbelievable is that I found a journal article from I believe it was a study of megafaunal extinction in India, but it was talking about global extinction. And it said around 50,000 BC, for reasons we do not understand, a large portion of the megafauna suddenly went extinct. Now, again, I'm not saying that's proof. I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying he didn't say 90,000 BC. Similarly, when he said 210,000 BC, with the first incarnations of what he would call Homo sapiens that had semi-modern forms, study from Rice University confirms what they call mitochondrial Eve, the woman that we're allegedly all human beings on Earth are descended from. Well, what's the date? 200,000 BC. And this became very weird and creepy for me as time went on, because I'll give you a final example for, Jason Colavito and friends out there, the debunking community, Michael Shermer, hi. Edgar Casey said in 1932, he was describing the final destruction of Atlantis around 10,000 BC. And he said around 10,500 people who were in touch with, it's not specified, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, whatever, a group of beings at a portal that allegedly existed, were given foreknowledge of this impending disaster and were told to prepare an evacuation and a preservation of the records. And one of the places they went was the Giza Plateau, and for various reasons. And in this reading, he says just offhandedly, oh, and by the way, at that time, the Nile River flowed into the Atlantic near the Congo end of the country, of the continent, rather, of Africa. And, in 1932, I'm sure whoever was listening to, okay, how do you know that? Well, in 1986, after satellite technology had gotten to the point where they could do shuttle imaging radar and actually go 6 to 10 feet below the sands of the Sahara Desert, what do they find? What is Dr. Macaulay, a member of the American Geological Institute or something to that effect, with his whole team, what did they find using NASA radar and satellite imaging? They indeed find that the Nile River emptied into the Atlantic in a trench on the border of Cameroon and Nigeria at the end of what in his time would have been the extension of the Congo territory. Now, again, could just be a weird little wacky clue, but I don't think that's the case. I think that in some way, and that's just the archaeological evidence he was discussing, it's not counting the 14,000 total plus readings that he gave for people who were directly cured, who he didn't have to see. He literally could remote view their ailment from his couch. And this was confirmed by Princeton, Harvard, Stanford. The New York Times wrote an article about it. It was not fake. There's sworn affidavits. There's an entire institute dedicated to preserving these records. So it's why I focused on him so much as a source, but at the same time, he really provided I would say if the book is called Visions of Atlantis, and it's like when you go for an eye exam and the doctor says, okay, is this, you like this one or this one or that for your glasses. If the lens now is, okay, it's good, it's better than before, but it's not great. Well, then the 2020 vision or 2015 vision, like I'm blessed to have the eagle eye, that would be the visions of Frederick Oliver, who really filled in all the pieces that Casey did not provide. Because as I stated, Casey's readings were very short. I believe there are only 500 on Atlantis. Most of them involve past lives. Very few, unless the questioner directly asked him a question, were given specific dates or specific aspects of what actual lived life was like at this time. And I was just very curious because Plato describes essentially a Bronze Age, quite complicated city architecturally, but nothing that's a stretch of the mind. He's describing they sailed with triremes, they fought with chariots, they all had to pay tribute to the king. It's essentially why most people think, okay, he's just rehashing his time in Athens and putting it in the Atlantic. Okay, great. Well, the real two smoking guns for me were when I discovered and read, which I don't think anybody that's reviewed it has truly read, because this is one of the weirdest books, and I've read, I'm sure like you, thousands of books. This is one of the strangest books I've ever read or probably has ever been written, which is Frederick Oliver's A Dweller on Two Planets, which, if you're not familiar, viewers, with, is an alleged clairaudient channeled book that was a series of notes written, I believe, at the pace of 2 pages a day for 3 years, 2 years, something to that degree, by a 17-year-old kid living in 1881 during the gold rush in Eureka, California. Fair enough. You say, okay, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is, in this book, this person says, before Edgar Casey, I received these messages from an occult preceptor who spoke to me while I was out prospecting with my parents. I stopped working. I came home. This is corroborated by other people who knew him. And I started writing this book, and I take no credit for it. After he died very young at the age of 33. His mother printed it. He died in 1899. His mother formatted it in 1904. And I think the first pressing was 1906, 1908. And then the first major release was 1920. So when people say, well, this is just fiction, I would ask, possibly. We cannot discount that. However, as with Casey, the things Frederick Oliver says describing the life of a person named Philos, who he calls his occult preceptor, who speaks to him, who himself is using Frederick Oliver to describe his past life as a character named Zaum Numenos in Atlantis, specifically on the island of Poseid, which is quite important, that word Poseid. It was astounding, because I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm reading, and he says at one point, I'm seeing 2 women, I'm dating 2 princesses, and I got to be careful because I'm talking to them both on my name as I'm traveling in my veil. And he has an index at the beginning of the book, and he says all of these words are written in Poseidian, but translated into English, this is what we called all of these things. So you look up, what is a name? Well, it's a handheld mirror in which you can see people anywhere in the world and you can see their voice, see their picture. And in fact, at one point, you can project them holographically a la Star Wars. Now, that's quite strange. And when people accuse him, and myself included, because I try always to play devil's advocate, and say, okay, well, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea came out in, I believe, 1876. So maybe as a teenager he read, maybe. There's nothing in there like that. That's about a submarine that has an electric, motor that can zap natives. It's very primitive, and the science behind it is never really explained on a level even approaching what he describes. In this book, he describes a theoretical physics of the sun. He has a 3-page soliloquy on cathodicity, magnetism, gravity. He has an entire religion that's internally coherent. He describes the Essenes, which in 1881, unless you were a theology major at probably the Vatican, you have never heard of the Essenes. You really didn't hear about it in the United States until the Gnostic Gospels came out in the 70s or the early 80s. He also describes the technology of the time. And I find it interesting because, his Atlanteans on his timeline had what he calls veil, which were cigar-shaped aluminum. He specifically says aluminum craft that were driven essentially by entraining with a power source on the main island to repel gravity. They could travel in any medium, which is, I find quite interesting, since multiple, whatever you want to call them, UAP, UFO reports have, these things coming out of the ocean, going into the sky, into space, transmedial craft. So that is interesting. And also his discussion of the fall of Atlantis, I found fascinating, because in his timeline, he's living in 11,116 BC. He specifically says that, which again, it's quite an important date when you corroborate it with so many other things that we find in the book. That gap between roughly 11,000 and 9,600, which was the date Plato gave, which is also bizarre because that's literally the date of the end of the Younger Dryas period, when the Earth began warming. Again, he didn't say 12,300 BC. He said literally, when he was writing in 361 BC, there was the story of a country in an island that ended at 9,600 BC. Well, in A Dweller in Two Planets, and I'll end on this as far as the content of the book, because I would love people to read it. But in describing the fall of Atlantis, it was a critical point of departure for me, because he says in 11,116, we had all this technology. We had a massive tower that was, 4,000 feet tall, that could ward off lightning, control the weather. We had veil. We had essentially holographic smartphones. We could project at the highest level our technology around the world, and essentially a futuristic vision. So people say, okay, well, that's not at all what Plato said. How did they go from that to triremes and fighting with bronze chariots? Well, he describes at the end, and he's very specific about it. He says, in the course of the next 800 years, so his timeline is roughly 10,300 BC for the end of this, but still close enough. He says, in the course of that 800 years, society devolved into essentially a technocratic, transhumanist elite who knew how to control everything, and at the end could project themselves as pure consciousness or electricity while affecting physical matter. And so they had no use for these things. And the average person who lost that infrastructure didn't remember how to build a veil, how to build a name. Just like today, if we had an accident or a catastrophe, I wouldn't know how to build an iPhone, but I could describe it. Okay. We wouldn't have software engineers to keep the servers running, even if we had a functioning iPhone. And And so he says by the end, essentially, it devolved by 10,000 BC into a semi-state of barbarism where human sacrifice began. And finally, divine judgment was meted out, and that was it. And so that was an important thing, because so many people either say, well, there's just Plato's account. It's nothing, not a big deal. He was talking about the island of Thera where there was a volcano, or he was talking about Athens, or it was fiction, or it was in Morocco, or whatever the common, flavor of the day is for the where is Atlantis. But if you look at it more, and I'll end this section of this on this, if you look at it more like, well, it was a continent, then it was a series of 5 islands, then it was a series of, then there were 3, and the main one was called Poseid, which makes sense because in Plato's account, he says in the center of Atlantis was a statue of Poseidon surrounded by the Nereids. So he was probably talking about the culture and the island at the same time. But that was a critical part. And, once I started to think about the time spans, it made a lot more sense, because if you think about what was the United States like in 1800 compared to 2020, in 220 years, we've made incomprehensible technological advances. So how long would it take if nuclear war or a catastrophe, natural or human-made, wiped us out? Would it take 800 years? Would it take even through natural decline that long to regress into how we lived in the 1800s? And if somebody found our records and they only had a record of that, they'd say, well, these people, they had wooden ships, and they used sail, and they fought with sticks and stones in the streets. What are you talking about? They went to space and had rockets that could land and all this. What is this? Well, no, we used to, but then we had a nuclear war or something. So I think it's an important point to consider as we discuss this topic, is just, it's a vaster time scale than any historical time period. And on top of that, it doesn't follow a linear path. It goes up, it goes down, it goes way down, it's destroyed, it's rebuilt, it's destroyed again. It's really the default, if you believe this, or believe the evidence, I rather say, it's really the default state of humanity for the majority of the time we've existed as such. And really the gap between the final destruction of Atlantis and what we call the Industrial Revolution today, which is a roughly 10,000 plus year gap, is the weird exception where we have not been a technologically, spiritually supreme group of people. And I think that psychologically explained to me why so many people are drawn to Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Star Trek, why this inbuilt science fiction thing is such a big thing. I think it's because we know that was real on an intuitive level. And to me, the story of Atlantis was the kind of key to understanding why these themes keep recurring throughout literature or film. So, end of soliloquy. I'm starting to sound like Edgar Casey now. We're done for the present, like he said. We're done for the present.
Well, that's a hell of an introduction, hell of an opening spiel. Michael Le Flem here, ladies and gents, on fire. So, okay, let's pick out a couple of sort of threads to pull on. Say, one thing we haven't done is explain your sort of origin story and how you ended up on this path, and why you ended up writing a book about such kooky weirdness.
Oh, wow, my origins. Okay, well, I was engineered in a laboratory in Canada. They put metal claws in my hands. So no, I grew up in South Florida, and I was always interested in in the ocean. And, I grew up on Atlantic Boulevard next to the Atlantic Ocean. I went to Florida Atlantic University.
Hmm.
And, I didn't even remember this until I started writing the book. One day when I was 8 years old, maybe 9, my grandfather took me to breakfast and he said, there's something I don't understand. And he spoke many languages. He says, why is the Basque language similar to Nahuatl language in Mexico? Now I'm 9 years old. I said, what? I go, what are you talking about? I just want to go get a milkshake or something. He said, no, I don't understand it, but somebody does. I don't know. And he was an amateur, language expert. He was a French language teacher. And, then as time went on, I think I always was just curious, like, as I was learning in school, the second kind of weird thing was when I was learning about the pyramids, and off the bat, something just did not gel with me. And it was the fact that these were chambered and aligned. I said, I don't get it. I think with the innocence of a kid, I just said, I don't get it. What do you mean a tomb? I've seen a mausoleum. I used to live next to a cemetery. And I said, that mausoleum doesn't have secret chambers and water flows, and it's not connected to the rip. And the teacher just never had a good answer for me. And that really angered me because I was, really inquisitive. And, as time went on, when I went to university and things, I became more, I think, of a materialist, just like most people that go to secular college. That's what they push. And I had come from a traditional Catholic school background, so I was in fact relieved to not hear the same thing, and quite shocked at realizing so much of what I had been told was one-sided. But to answer your question, one day, I have no idea. It really was as bizarre as what Frederick Oliver said. And I don't say this lightly as a joke, but I was sitting in the park, Wicker Park in Chicago. And it's the only time this has ever happened. I don't claim to know what it was, but it felt almost like a hypnotic suggestion of an urgency. And there's a story that must be told. And next thing, I find myself in the bookstore that I used to go to, and they had an alternative history section, paranormal history section, and there it was. I saw The Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly, and I just started reading it, and before I knew it, I was coming back to the bookstore, finished it, and really it started to affect my life, because anytime I would try to watch a history documentary or even teach history as a history professor, I started to think, this is not right. This is not right. And I have to explore this more, from myself as a historian. And, it resulted in weird things. It resulted in me, leaving parties where I would say, I have to go home and look at this picture. And people say, Michael, you're going crazy and this is not healthy. But I didn't care. And, I even taught, believe it or not, I snuck Graham Hancock's Magicians of the Gods into the syllabus, believe it or not, at Loyola University. They had to buy 45 copies. You're welcome for that. And I was shocked that when the teacher is actually open-minded and interested in seeing what students want to learn, that overwhelmingly all of them said, this makes sense. They were quite shocked because they said, well, I just took an ancient history class last semester, and we learned that history began in Sumeria. And I said, okay, that's fine. But does this make sense? Who is he citing as a source? Do you believe the findings of Dr. James Kennett with the nano diamonds and the comet, and all the things? Now that the book is finished, I can watch this ancient apocalypse that everybody's freaking out over.
Yep.
But I was really surprised that it was the norm that most of the students said, this and Hancock didn't talk about veil ships and names and ancient technology. My book is much more out there in terms of that. He just said, look, there could have been a civilization that predated 10,500 BC that was on some level technologically advanced. He doesn't really specify anything more than that. And, it was really also disheartening to see just, in recent times, how hard the academy, and I don't even want to say that, but just how hard the establishment in its various iterations pushes back against this. And I explore that topic as well, in terms of just why do people, what is it? Is it arrogance? Is it fear? Like that could happen to us? Is it something else? Like, I've built a career on this, and I've always said, I welcome critiques of this book. It makes me better. It makes the book better. It has nothing to do with my personality, my reputation. I really couldn't care less what people think about me. I let the evidence speak for itself. And, I think the best historians and, explorers and people, that are on the cusp, people like you, people like Graham Hancock, people like Randall Carlson, people that take all the flack, to show, look, there's another way to look at this. This is not really explained by your 8th grade Houghton Mifflin textbook, which, is going to just repeat the same thing. So I think, to answer your question in an extremely long-winded way, it was a obsessive result of this strange event that has never happened to me in any other of the many books and articles and things I've written. I've never had that compulsion, urgency to tell this story. And I think if I didn't have that, it would have taken me 15 years instead of 7.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool, man. Thanks for fleshing that out. So I guess, that was kind of the point of the parallax view, chapter 3, being willing to see the same information from a different perspective. I know you wanted to kind of touch on that, and I reread that just before we kicked off. So yeah, tell us more about your thinking around that.
Yes. Well, it's pretty clear to me that if we're being intellectually honest and we're applying the same standards that we apply, for example, to traditional mainstream history, like who was Julius Caesar, who was Alexander the Great. I'll give you an example. We talk about Alexander the Great, Oliver Stone makes movies, this, that. Okay, fine. That's great. I mean, pun intended, that's wonderful. And I don't think anybody believes that story is fictional, because there's genetic evidence. You can go to Afghanistan and see people with Greek DNA, and you go to that town and, oh, okay. Yeah, okay. But there's details like, for example, we have no idea how tall he was. We have 6 different sculptures of him. We don't even know if Darius did he have 500,000 men at Gaugamela? Did he have 100,000? We have actually no idea, because the primary source for that, Ptolemy's account, was lost to history. So we use 2 or 3 main accounts, Appian, this, that, and the other, to piece together basically a fantasy story. And we teach that, and History Channel runs specials on it, and that's it. That's true. But how many thousands of people wrote about him, knew him, had differing views? Appian wasn't even there. So that's a true account. I mean, and that's from, 2,300 roughly years ago. So when you're talking about if this indeed was real, think about a quote that I include in there, which is an incredible quote from Hugh Lynn Casey, which I'll paraphrase, which is essentially Edgar Casey's son. And he says, look, if a tidal wave or some catastrophe today, and he's writing in the 60s, I think, destroyed the United States, just the United States, wiped it off the map. He says, do you think in the year 14,027, something like that, he goes, somebody comes around, drills a 2-inch hole in the bottom of the ocean. What do you think they're going to find? You think they're going to find a Hyundai Sonata and an iPhone and Brendan Murphy's guitar over there? No, they're going to find what we still find at the Mid-Atlantic Trench. They're going to say, well, there's a freshwater diatom. So there's a fossilized remain of a cat. So they worshipped cats.
Yeah.
And the lake was a part of their cat worship. I mean, literally, like what could you say about that? So that's why I tried to go just full, not quite leap of faith, but use the best, most reliable, or just the most internally consistent psychic sources, so to speak, to fill in these gaps. Because from Plato's account, we have little. From commentary on Plato's account, we have even less. His account is still the best. And what's left? We have what we have in chapter 4, fragments. We have the fact that common names in Andorra sound like common names in Mexico, which makes no sense whatsoever. But at the same time, I don't know how my grandfather came upon that pre-internet. He read a lot of weird things. But when you look at the Edgar Cayce reading, and he says when they fled Atlantis, they went to the Pyrenees, they went to Giza, they went to the Yucatan, you go, okay, he didn't say they went to northern France. He didn't say they went to Sweden. He didn't say they went to, he said they went to the Pyrenees. And where is the Basque country? It's literally in the Pyrenees. And he didn't say they went to, Arizona or Canada. He said they went to Yucatan, where the Nahuatl language originates. So they think. So again, these things were almost impossibly statistically accurate. If this is all made up, then well, what would you consider acceptable psychic source would be my question. And that's the kind of impetus of the parallax view, which really, it's not even so much defending the clairvoyant views. I tried to show how mainstream archaeological discoveries, the things Hancock and friends discover, is, I mean, look at the pyramids, for God's sake, not to get angry, but I always ask people, I don't care what they are, I don't care what they do, were they spiritual machines, could you astrally project, were they power plants, were they space stations? I could really give a damn. I ask anybody, I do care, it would be fascinating to know, but we probably will never know conclusively, because if it's true indeed that they are 10,000 BC origination, it's 10,490 according to Edgar Cayce, so 12,500 years old, naturally they would have been adapted over thousands of years for different purposes. But I always tell people, and this is about as aggressive as I get in writing, but I say, look, round the number off to what, 2.3 plus million blocks that each weigh 4,000 plus pounds. Okay, so go outside, take the wheels off your Jeep Grand Cherokee with the tires, just the frame and the motor, and then put 1,000 pounds more in the trunk, and then move that roughly 550 miles with your friends, and you can build a ramp or a mound. You could go to Home Depot and do that, and then do that 2.3 whatever more million times. And I don't think most people even know these things. Like, I think most people think, well, I've built things with bricks. How hard could it be? Well, it's quite hard. In fact, it's absurd, really, on the face of it, that these things were built using even conventional machinery in 2022 would be Impossible. There is no machine. In fact, Graham Hancock in the 90s interviewed somebody who was a professional freight lifter, and he said, wait, what? How much do those things weigh? And he said, how many are there? And Hancock, and I think Boval was with him, said, yeah, could you do that? And he worked on the docks in New York. He said, that's impossible. Like, nobody could do that. And that was in 1997, I think. So I always work backwards, because if the debunkers are going to come at me with, you're crazy, I say, please explain this to me. Like, and don't just say they did it with a mound that was really big. No, you now have to sit here, like I've sat here, and please explain it. Like, please explain to the jury how they got the mound. What did it look like? Where's the record of the mound besides Herodotus, who was writing, you know, if this date is correct, 10,500 years after the damn thing was built. So what is he? And he had a bias against the Egyptians at the time. He thought they were inferior. He said, look at these frivolous monuments that these people build when we have, you know, aqueducts and things like that. So when you look at the Egyptian sources, what do they say? They say things that, according to Jason Colavito, look like magic and implanted medieval myths. And I'm sure many things were embellished, because those myths or those stories were written themselves 12,000 plus years after the purported date, according to Edgar Cayce and others, of 10,500. So I'm not saying they're the truth, but all of those say, written over hundreds of years during the medieval period in various parts of the Middle East, they say the same thing. They say we are warned of an impending cosmic catastrophe, and we were told to build a refuge or a redoubt against that in this region, and put within it all the knowledge of the past to preserve against the coming flood. That's what they say, all of them. And so it becomes this question of like, well, you're a debunker. Yeah, well, Herodotus was a debunker. And he, in fact, Herodotus was much more intelligent than you on orders of magnitude. So I'm going to listen to his debunking first, but that's one source who was from a hostile neighboring country, who was getting told stories 500 hand from the originators who, according to Cayce, built this. So I wouldn't call that a primary account.
No, that's right.
By any stretch. And again, in an absurd way, as somebody trained as a professional historian, as bizarre as it sounds, the best primary accounts of that time period are the Edgar Cayce readings.
Yeah.
Because using just logical deduction, if he was able to locate missing people, oil deposits, heal people, if he knew the Nile River flowed into the Atlantic, well, that leads me to believe he was probably more than not accurate about these dates. When he picked the date of 10,490 to 10,390 for the construction time of the Great Pyramid, again, he didn't say 12, he didn't say 50, he said it ended in the year 10,390 BC. They finished it. Well, what does Robert Boval find out? Well, he looks at the aerial map in the Cairo Museum of the three pyramids, realizes they're aligned with Orion, does a precession of the equinox regression in his computer. Well, gee, what's the date that those three things line up? 10,400 BC. Now, just a weird, wacky coinkydink.
Yeah.
So, again, after just hitting you over the head with these things, you start to go, and it scared me, because it's the implications of this, if true, change the way I think about the past, and really change the way I think about the present, and what our roles in this whole game really are. Because if we're just kind of relearning everything, that's a very different disposition than, we've got an iPhone 13 and
we're the top of the pile.
Yeah, it's I guess it's a humbling experience when you realize, yeah, we can do crazy things. I'm not denying that. Like seeing the Falcon rocket land, I'm not so cynical as to say, that's no big deal. Like that's a huge deal. But in other ways, I think certain technologies in the United States and the West have gone exponentially one way, like communications technology, maybe even rocketry, until Elon with the landing rocket hadn't really progressed since the 50s. But in many ways, we're, compared to the Casey and Oliver descriptions of Atlantean life, very, very behind in terms of a global crystal that can power using basically solar radiation channeled across Wi-Fi networks that can, Casey even describes, you don't need to have a heater in your house. You heat your house through calorivayance conveyed through the crystal with receptors in your house to pick up resonant wave. This is quite interesting. And so I think, like, perhaps, if nothing else, it's an interesting kind of vision of the future. Although it took place in what we call the past, on a timeline from left to right, which itself is artificial, doesn't mean really anything. Where is yesterday on a line in your life, Brendan? Were you here? Now you're here, but we're so trained to think like that it's understandable, because you go to school and they put 10,000 BC on this part and we're here. And most people organize their lives like that. I do as well. So it's difficult to wrap your mind, I think, around the cyclical nature of history, because it really takes the wind out of the sails of people who think, in 5 years we're going to have this and that and upload our consciousness into computers and that's it. And yay. It's like, well, according to Barbara Hand Clow's reading, they tried that. And that was not good. And that's a quite interesting chapter on what she says, that when she wrote that in 1992, it's unbelievable compared to the last 2 years, what she said, how bizarrely accurate her description of one of the destructions of Atlantis was to current pushes for transhumanism. In her description, it was a transhumanist Pleiadian scientist king that was responsible for destroying the island at the end through a misapplication of a technology designed to make people who were already chipped with the crystal implants more obedient because they were rebelling. Her words.
Where have we heard this before?
I think I've heard it from a World Economic Forum post or something. I can't recall. But it was just kind of a chapter that I wanted to write because, and it was a preemptive attack. I'll say that right now on the record, because the discussion is valid. It's quite important. It's fascinating. You realize most people that you walk up to, just like with extraterrestrials or anything, they believe it. They're just waiting for you to say you believe it. And the only reason they're waiting for you to say that is because the sheer weight of mainstream consensus reality in terms of shaming people is so strong that people would rather not talk about something they believe in than think, well, this person is just going to call me crazy or something like that.
Yeah, so exactly. With that said, let me just have a quick look at some of my notes here. So this is such an interesting book, man. We can go so many places with it. And I am going to obviously encourage everyone to read this thing. I liked there was a little interesting bit about the link between Plato and Socrates, which is something that I don't think I knew at the point where I was reading. I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. So we know about Plato's, account of Atlantis, but it was actually apparently because of Socrates, and that it's like Plato's the mouthpiece, but I think you said in the book that it was his interpretation of what Socrates said that was so key.
Right. And in fact, that's that's a thread that mainstream historians might debate. What's very interesting about what you said is in another channeler, Phyllis Schlemmer's account, who was a famous channeler from the 70s, whose book I quoted, The Only Planet of Choice, who basically was responsible for Gene Roddenberry creating the Star Trek franchise and using terms like the Federation because she described getting extraterrestrial messages from a galactic federation. So in her account of Atlantis, which is quite bizarre, in fact, don't really want to talk about some of the things she said on there, not appropriate, but a lot of perversions and things like this in the book towards the end of the culture. Not surprising.
And that came up in Casey's readings too, didn't it?
In Casey's readings, in Oliver's reading, it's an absolutely horrifying account that he describes of basically not the day it ended, because he said it didn't end after this event, but that was the final straw. And it was when a priestess from the Law of One essentially went to plead with people who had converted the Incalathan pyramid into a ritual sacrifice chamber. And then they end up doing horrifying things to her. And it's at that point that an apparition holographically appears, a la Star Wars Rogue One, and says, basically, the end is near. Attend ye, Atlan will no longer be beheld in the whole course of the sun. And goodbye. In Phyllis Schlemmer's account, though, she describes the chain of custody, as you mentioned, with the story. And she says that it was Socrates who was used as a channel, like a Casey, and that Plato interpreted it, and that it was purposely kind of occluded because the full details of that time period would have derailed ancient Greek society or just not been believed. And she said what was more important was that the possibility existed as a kind of projection from the past into the future, to kind of like science fiction, but based in reality, show you what could have been or could be going forward, which I thought was interesting. And, you know, it's not that strange because people think Plato and Socrates were, you know, like current academics from my field were very safe. You walk around with the little name tag, you know, you've never had a problem besides your Apple Pay doesn't work that day or whatever. But think about it. Plato and Socrates, I believe, fought back to back in a phalanx, in physical combat, in a skirmish or something like to that effect. Also, you know, the ability of these two people to come up with things like the allegory at the cave, in the allegory of the cave, or, you know, different things attributed to Socrates within the dialogues. A lot of people attribute that to the psychedelic experience that all great Greek philosophers had in the Eleusinian Mysteries, where they took probably a fermented form of ergot and were taken underground into this, you know, vast complex, which a lot of people went to. It was kind of like a Burning Man of ancient Greece, really. As they describe it, it sounds almost like Burning Man is like another Eleusinian mystery. And, you know, so in that sense, if these people were doing psychedelics, it's absolutely possible that these echoes of the past could have been coming through them. And whether Socrates sat on a couch and started channeling is who knows. Or better yet, whether he existed at all. Is he another fiction of Plato's Atlantean, you know, everything's made up if Plato said it, but we still teach that Plato is the founder of Western philosophy. We still base the, I don't know, the political system of the West on the Republic in many ways. So we think that's true, but, oh, don't you dare go back past that. Don't you in 100 years go past that nice, neat date of, you know, whatever, Mary Leakey finding a bone somewhere, and then fast forward 300,000 years to the unexplained simultaneous arrival of civilization with pyramidal structures and megalithic architecture all over the world, from hunter-gathering people who, were walking on their knuckles. It's
Yeah.
that's ridiculous to me. Like that story is just as stupid as the most absurd fantasies of, ancient aliens and things like this that take some, leaps of logic in many cases in my part, or just stretch evidence to a point where I become myself a debunker and go, wait a minute, not every megalithic structure was an alien spaceport,
Yeah.
not all of them, maybe some, maybe 2, 3, but not everything was an alien spaceport.
Yeah. And so it's so interesting, man, because and you did a really good job of documenting this, all of these structures around the world, and this was also the thrust of Graham Hancock's recent documentary, and obviously his writing, was they're encoding messages about a certain point in our time, in our history, and they're trying to convey this information like there was a disaster, there was something major that happened, a huge trauma, a huge catastrophe, and there's intelligent information being conveyed in them, and it's a very earthly, human kind of a story and a context. And in those instances, we don't need to, invoke the idea of ancient aliens or whatever to explain these things. There was clearly a purpose for them. I think it's quite obvious reading your book and similar types of work that an Atlantean civilization that was far more advanced than mainstream could ever possibly credit them definitely existed. And so that these other structures around the world, these other cultures where we've got so many clues, the linguistic similarities and all this stuff, they're legacy civilization, they're legacy cultures of this ruined entity. You'll find the full video and any bonus materials in my exclusive members-only portal, The Truthiversity. This unique creation is the official home for all my multimedia research and entertainment content. Updated regularly, my members get access to absolutely everything I create, including full podcasts, courses, articles, videos, audio files, the whole enchilada. Book your spot at truthiversity.com.